Hello everyone, my name is Fernando Tomlinson, and today I'll be giving you a presentation called The Blue Plague, a dive into the ransomware epidemic. As we get started, I'll take a couple of seconds here to tell you about myself. So I've been with the Department of Defense for 18 years. In my current capacity, I serve as the Technical Director of a Cyber Operations Center. Our focus is really on incident response and forensics, but it also goes into penetration testing and vulnerability assessment. So we do what you would call blue team and also red team, and then we have a mixture of that in which we do what's called purple teaming. I also serve as an adjunct professor at a local college in Georgia where I teach digital forensics and Python programming. Where time allows me, I'm a technology consultant with Reliable Cyber Solutions, and the focus of that organization is really cybersecurity training. As a PowerShell enthusiast, I've developed a number of tools within that language. And because I love PowerShell so much, I'm a co-author of a book called the PowerShell Conference Book Volume 2. In that book is a number of enthusiasts like myself who dedicate and really give their time to teach PowerShell and put together the content. We make no money from the proceeds of the book. All proceeds of the book go to underrepresented, underprivileged individuals who are trying to get their start in cybersecurity. So if you would, please help us with that endeavor. Now, when it comes to my presence on the internet, I have a blog, cyberfibers.com. I like to program and code, script, whatever you want to call it, and really develop tools and capabilities to enable cybersecurity professionals, in which I publish that code on my GitHub. I also am on Twitter, in which I like to proliferate the cybersecurity content in which I talk about and learn from others. So you can find me on Twitter at that handle as well. All right, so here's kind of our agenda as we start to get into this talk. All right, so first off, let's talk about the malware types, because when we start to talk about the malware types, we'll see where ransomware comes in. So we have things called viruses. Well, these things are nothing more than pieces of code that have the capability to copy themselves, and they typically look to corrupt a system and or destroy some data. We have worms that are kind of like viruses, but not really. And the big thing with worms is that they replicate themselves to other systems, right? They're typically self-reliant and they don't require other things to replicate themselves. We have ransomware, right? And this is really the basis of our talk. And ransomware seeks to deny access to a system or data until a ransom is paid. Now, that's interesting. All right, and as we jump down a little bit more, we have things like keyloggers that track and record every keystroke entry made on the system. Well, while these are just subsets and examples of malware types, again, the thing that we're focusing on is this whole ransomware thing. So really, let's dive into it a little bit more. What is it and how does it work? Well, we have a rather long definition there, but the thing that we'll highlight on is that not we, but ransomware seeks to deny individuals access to their data by way of making them pay a ransom. Okay, well, that's what I get from all of this, but let's look at this a little bit more. And when I say look at it a little bit more, we're looking at definitions from a number of cybersecurity organizations with great reputations in this field. And largely, their definitions vary, but if we were to sum it all up, it largely says the same thing. So why is this ransomware really a thing? And really, who does it target? Well, it targets home users. Why? Because the more PCs or systems that they can affect, the more money that these ransomware people can make. Okay, cool. Well, home users typically don't have data backups. So they, when ransomware hits their system, are likely more prone to pay because they don't have backups. They have little to no cybersecurity education, so when it comes to them identifying maliciousness, they largely struggle or miss the signs, and that's why they have the ability to click on whatever they see. They also don't keep their software up to date. And when we think about what's on the internet today, largely speaking, most of the systems are home users. So they become potential victims. So what about businesses? Because surely ransomware doesn't attack just home users. Well, that's absolutely correct. With businesses, we have the ability to um, disrupt the business. We have a higher chance of getting paid. Well, why is that? Well, John Bob, the home user, just doesn't have 20, 30, 40, $50,000 that he or she can pay for their data. But businesses, while they may or may not have it either, there's a higher chance that they could come up with that money to pay it. And attackers know that if they can get to businesses, well, every second that that business doesn't have the ability to conduct their e-commerce or whatever their focus is, that's money that that business is losing. So there's a higher propensity for them to try to pay it as well. So ransomware is a thing because right up front, the people want to instill fear and panic into their victims. And there's something about not being able to access the very thing that we own and or likely control that helps to instill that fear. So think about things that are on our systems today. We might have pictures and files and a number of other data types that we just take for granted that it's here today, but what happens when it's not available tomorrow? All right, and that is further amplified when we're looking at businesses. So look at some of the messages that when ransomware attacks us, what do they put on our systems? You know, you have stuff like, hey, your computer was used to visit websites with illegal content. To unlock your computer, you must pay $100 fine. And depending on the person, they may take that at face value, like, oh my gosh, my computer was used illegally and I need to pay so I don't get in further trouble or any trouble at all. So largely it instills fear in their victims. And why else is it a thing? Well, because it's lucrative, because people are paying, because people are in such a position that paying is the best thing, or so they feel, that they could do. And that really leads us to cyber extortion, right? So at its core, we have what that provides or what that really does, but it comes in the forms of multiple types of crime, right? So we have the encrypting of data and holding it hostage. You could have somebody threatening exposure. Hey, you have pictures that are showing you in less than desirable positions or what have you. So you could threaten to expose those. And then we can also look at just denying access to those data or services. So from an extortion, cyber extortion standpoint, it runs prevalent. So why is this stuff so impactful? Well, because we're going to temporarily or permanently lose sensitive data, proprietary data. Nobody wants to do that. Disrupt regular operations. If every day you need to be able to pump out, let's say 40 or 50 packages, if at any point you can't do that, and pumping out those packages are the very thing that allows you to make money, and you're disrupted by it, well, you're losing money because you can't do that very thing, right? So there's financial losses and there's potential harms to the reputation of the organization. I don't know about you, but if my favorite online retailer wasn't able to deliver the content in which I paid for in a timely fashion, I don't know how often I would continue to go back to them to pay for said content. So how does it even start? Well, largely speaking, a number of these vectors that are used to gain access to lay down as ransomware is through spear phishing. Right? Look at what's going on, where somebody sends you a well-crafted or really horribly crafted email, and then you click on certain things in there, particularly links, thinking that you trust the sender of the email, and now they're able to exploit your system and gain access without you knowing, and that allows them to begin their installation of their ransomware. There's also just random software vulnerabilities out there, and this speaks to why we should keep our system up to date. Because gaining unauthenticated access to our machine allows them to do certain things like install the ransomware. And then we have just other secondary infections that are based upon other things going on. What we know This is how people are doing it, yet it still continues to happen. We'll address that further on. So ransomware, where did it come from? Well, the first instance of it was developed back in 1989, and it was by a guy by the name of Dr. Joseph Pop. And his big thing was he was taking advantage of the AIDS epidemic, if you will. So at the time, all we had was floppy disks. So he developed, or really made, 20,000 copies of it, and he distributed them at a conference, right? And they were labeled AIDS Information Introductory Diskette. And the thing about this was, it was supposed to have a survey on the disk, in which it did, but it also had ransomware. And this ransomware laid dormant on the system. And after the system itself rebooted 90 times, it replaced a very important file on a Windows machine, and it hid in a specific directory, the C drive. And then it prompted the user with what we see off to the right there, telling them that their system has been accidentally infected and a number of other things, and it wanted the user to pay a what's called license fee of $189 and $378. Really, it's an and or. But how did it want the money? Well, it wanted it as a check, and it wanted you to send it to a P.O. box in Panama. Nonetheless, this couldn't last forever, so this guy was definitely arrested, and in court he claimed that he donated the revenue to AIDS research, right? But that wasn't really the case. He eventually pleaded guilty to mental issues and was found unfit to really stand the trial, although he tried to plead guilty, and was deported back to the U.S. and remained there until he died in 2007. So they exported him back to the U.S. because he was in the U.K. Now, that really started the gate for not cryptocurrency, but other aspects of ransomware. So if we go down the chain here, we see the first instance being in 1989, and then around 2008, we had this cryptocurrency kind of come to life. And we think of cryptocurrency as like Bitcoin. And what does that really do for us? Well, it's anonymous, secure, instant, not regulated, which means it's perfect for extortion, because somebody can take over your system. You can say, feed me or send me Bitcoin. And because of all the things we just mentioned about it, well, now it's great from the perspective of ransomware. So here are some other types of ransomware that were developed through the years. So we have Locker, we have Crypto. And when we look at this, Locker seeks to deny access to the machine. It affects the user's interface, so not the underlying files, i.e., think of a pop-up on your screen. The stuff under it on your desktop or other windows you had up aren't affected. It's just that the pop-up doesn't allow you to close it, minimize it, or what have you, so you can then interact with the other stuff on your machine. So Locker, that's all it did. Essentially, it was a pop-up that blocked everything else on the screen and didn't allow you to access or really get back to your main screen. It largely utilized social engineering. Now, Crypto, on the other end, prevented access to files and or data, and this is where ransom truly comes into play. It preyed on people who did not have backups. Why? Because if we had backups, then we would just largely implement those backups to then get us back in a good state. So then in 2012, we started to see another aspect of ransomware. And this one looked to exploit vulnerabilities in our web browser. It largely redirected those people to adult sites, and then the ransomware would kick in as it exploited that browser. Off to the right, we see what would be shown. So we're looking at, hey, FBI Cybercrime Division. We see a picture of some personnel and maybe a well-crafted but not so well-crafted screen, and it wanted users to pay $300. It wanted them to do so in the form of prepaid cards. So what were the real tactics that got people? Well, it impersonated law enforcement. It locked the user out of their system, and then later versions of it actually incorporated password stealers. So although it was forcing you to pay a ransom, it was also harvesting passwords on your system in the background. So from a person that's not really well versed in this was a highly sophisticated one. But truly, it was easily to remove. We could reboot our machine, put it in safe mode, and within the registry of our system, we could alter a registry key and gain access back to our machine. So here's another instance of it, because with every form of ransomware, there's always different campaigns or variations. So while the last one was talking about the FBI, this one is NSA Internet Surveillance Program, right? So again, the more real we can make this, or somebody can make this look, the higher the chance of them being able to get it off without a hitch. So CryptoLocker in 2013, it typically used email as a vector to infect a person, right? So typically phishing from that perspective. Uh, it looked to encrypt 70 file types on a system, and this was the one of the first ones that started to use encryption, and it used asymmetric. So that allows us to have a public key that is widely known. In this case, it would encrypt the files with a public key, and then if somebody wanted to uncrypt them, they would have to use the private key. The public key, as the name would indicate, is public for any and everybody, and then the private key is the very thing that nobody should have a copy of. So when that ransom was paid, the private key was used to decrypt that information. And they largely used fake domains to have people uh, utilize for their fee, if you will, and it affected over 250,000 systems. This was propagated over a botnet called Game Over Zeus, and in 2014, DOJ was able to take that down. The private keys were recovered from that C2 server and then made allowed to decrypt people who fell victim to this ransomware of sorts. And largely speaking, the campaign was something like this. All right, you'd have the infected bot of that Game Over Zeus would generate a number of domains. We see that in the middle of the screen. And those domains, they look fake, right? Just look at them. Alphanumeric characters and then the random top level domains. The attacker would know what those domains are, and then it would allow him to generate a list in which he would use for his campaign. Then the attacker would register one of those domains in advance and point that to his command and control server, if you will. So now you have the infected system doing a DNS query or reaching out to these domains, and then based upon the response, the system would communicate with one of those domains. Now, from there, the actual command and control server would download whatever the actual ransomware is. Now, this was very interesting because it wasn't a thing of, hey, this ransom utilizes Fernando.com. And as long as we can take down Fernando.com, we can stop this ransom from continuing on. Because it randomly generated domains, one time we might see Fernando.com is where the ransomware is coming from. The next time we might see Tomlinson.com or some variation of it. So it made it very difficult to take down that campaign until they gained control of that command and control server. All right, in 2014, we had one that we mainly seen in Austria and New Zealand. It spread primarily through email, and it looked to harvest emails on the system so that way it could send and propagate ransomware to other machines. On a Windows system, there's this thing called volume shadow copies. And these volume shadow copies are essentially backups of the machine. So what this ransomware would do is automatically look for these backups and delete them. And then it would demand ransom of $500 in Bitcoin. It wanted it to be paid within 3 days, right? Receiver differs from each victim. So every person received something different. So it wasn't as standard as we may think in that construct. So its campaign looked to do something like this, where we started off with a bad person, a ransomware owner, if you will, emailing out a compromised email from a website that they compromised, right? So in this case, maybe Fernando.com was compromised, and now I send out an email to people saying it's coming from Fernando.com. From that aspect, the user clicks on it, and when the user clicks on it, rather than it going back to the true Fernando.com, it goes to my malicious version of it. And from there, the user is prompted with a CAPTCHA. And if you're not familiar with a CAPTCHA, that's one of those things that pops up and it wants you to either click on a particular type of picture in a grid of pictures, or it wants you to type in the text that you see. This is an effort to reduce the chance of the interaction being from a bot, if you will, or a fake person. So by virtue of using these CAPTCHAs, this is the way that they identify that it is truly a real person. And when they do that, now they continue on to the site and they get infected with the ransomware. All right, in 2015, we've seen another variant, right? And this one utilized email and vulnerable servers. It looked to encrypt 185 different file types. Now, what was different about this one is it also looked to go after gaming data. So if you were playing stuff like Call of Duty or World of Warcraft, and there were files associated with those games or other games on your system, it would also encrypt that as well. You may be wondering, well, all right, well, who does that affect? Well, it affects the gamers. And while you may not be a gamer and may not be affected by it, an actual gamer would be. And they likely, depending on what type of data it is or what it contains, they may pay that ransom. This ransom looked to get $550 in Bitcoins, and it increased as time went on, going up to $1,000. And we see the screen that is being shown when that ransom hits. All right, so this actual ransomware got decommissioned in 2016, and oddly enough, the developers just stopped. We think that they switched over to work on more sophisticated ransomware, and in doing so, they released the master key, so anybody who had fell victim to this could get their data back. All right, another one we seen in 2016 went after malicious, or went after Microsoft Office products, right? And they looked to enable macros, which are essentially add-ons to Microsoft Office products. These things typically spread through email, and they were distributed through a botnet. So as we look at the picture, we see a whole bunch of googly garbage in our perspective. And we see that our system says macros have been disabled. But the sheet tells us to enable macros if we want the encoding to show correctly. So we think that it's just not showing because macros are disabled. And when we click to enable it, that allows malicious code to run in the background. Now, what's interesting is when we look at the malicious code, it's set in there to not affect machines that have a Russian language pack. Well, that may lead you to believe that the authors of this malware are Russian. I'd like to agree with you. This ransom seeks to get $5,000 or $10,000. All right. So when you look at, we've substantially started going up in our price of sorts. So really, this campaign followed this methodology. Send a person an email. User opens the email in the attachment. User enables the macro to help render the data, as we previously mentioned. The binary is downloaded from a website and executed. Backups are deleted and files are encrypted, all unbeknownst to the user. Again, their system could be blocking this stuff. We tell them, or somebody tells them, that the data that they're reading isn't going to be rendered unless they enable these macros. And down below, we see the screen that's being shown back for the user. All right, so in 2016, we had one that looked to overwrite the master boot record. And this, when it's done, forces a blue screen of death. So it actually started to alter the machine. And in doing so, there's a way for us to repair it called check disk. And when somebody runs check disk to identify the problem and or fix it, we then utilize, not we, the ransomware utilized encryption to encrypt the master file table. And the master file table is actually a table of contents on a Windows machine. So as we seek to click on a file on the desktop or on our user folder, how does Windows know where it's at? Well, it's indexed and is listed in the master file table. So if the master file table can't be accessed to therefore understand where things are at, the system is rendered unusable. All right, so it blocked access to the whole machine, and it looked to get a ransom of $300. Now, when we look at just geographically who was affected, well, we see the vast majority, at the time at least, were in the Ukraine. So we can speculate who was really utilizing this and utilizing it to propagate of sorts, right? Now, it isn't warmable, meaning it could not replicate on its own, but there were things that were built in that allowed it to spread. And in doing so, in the end, it cost something to the tune of $10 million in fees, right? So we had stuff like FedEx having to pay like $300 million. We had a French construction company that paid like $384 million. A pharmaceutical company paid like $870 million. It was crazy, right? So this was 2016. And then from that came another one called WannaCry. All right, and this affected over 300,000 machines in 150 countries, caused billions of dollars in damages, and it primarily went after Windows 7. Now, within 6 hours, the ransomware was $300, and within the 3 days, it went up to $600. So while that may not seem like a lot, when you look at how it increased its fee and look at the number of machines that it was hitting, it was astronomical. All right. It was one of the most biggest outbreaks in our history. So how did it actually propagate? Well, number one, it started with an exploit. All right. And it exploited a particular process on Windows. And then from there, it became an actual service. That service had a kill switch if it ever needed to kill off later on. The ransomware was dropped and it performed encryption. We see that file being something looking like a task scheduler. Task scheduler is typically or is a legitimate thing on a Windows box, Windows system. So in this case, this sought rather to imitate a legitimate file. And it brought down a number of other malicious files in which got executed. And then all the files that were encrypted, something to the tune of 176 different extensions, ended in WN cry. Now, largely speaking, all ransomware that's going to encrypt stuff always changes the extension. In this case, WN cry is what it changed the extension to, but other ones change it to things that meet the campaign in which they're doing. So that's just a couple of them throughout the years. So bringing it to more present day, for 2019, we had 50% of 582 cyber professionals that we asked about if their organization was prepared for ransomware, and 52% of them did not believe their organizations were prepared. Okay, that is scary. 34% of businesses hit with ransomware took 7 days or more to regain access. 7 days. Think of an organization that does millions of dollars of business or gains millions of dollars of revenue on a daily basis. And if it took 7 days for them to be offline, what does that do to that organization? Some can bounce back while others cannot. The average cost of ransomware, $133,000. Depending on the business, that's pennies to a dollar. Or it could be overwhelming where the business has to shut down because they just can't afford it. The healthcare hit hard, $25 billion in 2019. Right? Phishing emails increased by 109% from 2017 to 2019 because we know people will click on things, and the more sophisticated the email, the higher likelihood they'll click on it. Ransomware is behind 56% of malware attacks. So up front, we talked about 7 or 8 different malware attacks. 56% of them in 2019 were from ransomware. And guess what? We already know Bitcoin is anonymous, not regulated, all that good stuff. So 99% of ransoms were paid in that form of currency. Now, some more staggering statistics here. So the average incident lasted 9.6 days. The decryptor, the very thing that would decrypt the files, was supplied 96% of the time after payment. So you have a good chance of getting it. But let's read on. Data successfully recovered 93% of the time with the decryptor. So we're saying in some cases, people paid for the decryptor and the decryptor didn't even work. But the ransomware authors got the money. The people paying lost out on the money and they didn't get their data back. But 93% of the time, it did work. A new organization falls victim to this every 14 seconds. Every 14 seconds. And we expect that by 2021, that will be 11 seconds that a new victim will come about. 850 million ransomware infections were detected. 850 million, right? All in the year of 2019. Less than 25% of those attacks, though, were reported. Well, why is that the case? Well, people don't want to highlight to the world that their business fell victim to ransomware because that's going to affect their stocks, that's going to affect their shares, that's going to affect what people think of them. So they typically suffer in silence, pay in privacy, and they don't report it or seek outside help. Or if they are seeking outside help, there's NDAs, non-disclosure agreements where people can't talk about their organization, but could just talk about an instance of ransomware hitting a place. So, United States, all right, 966 organizations reported. 11% of them were state and municipal governments. 79% were healthcare. So, without going really deeper, right, 79%. Healthcare is by far the most targeted type of organization. 9% with universities and schools or what have you. So what were some of the outcomes when it came to healthcare? Patients had to be redirected. Some cases, patients probably ended up dying because they could not be redirected in a timely fashion. Medical records were inaccessible. Some cases permanently deleted. Procedures had to be canceled. 911 services interrupted, surveillance systems went offline, jails could not be remotely opened, schools did not have access to data about students to include medications or allergies. I mean, ransomware authors are ruthless. They want to put organizations in a compromising position in which forces them to pay that ransom. So looking at it from a state government perspective, right? And we're just looking at some fairly recent ones. We had the city of Atlanta. $52,000 is what was being asked of them. They did not pay. They did not want to bow down to the ransomware authors and really paint a story that paying a ransom is okay. So what happened? Years of data was destroyed to include police dashcam video, which was largely going to be used for court or other things. So since they didn't pay, the city of Atlanta ended up paying having costs of nearly $17 million just based upon what they had to pay to recover and the loss of business. So because they did not want to pay $52,000, it ended up costing them $17 million. Jackson County, Georgia, ransomware $400,000. They paid it. Why? It affected law enforcement database and controls. Okay. City of Baltimore, ransom of $75,000. They did not pay. Nearly disrupted every government department. The recovery cost, more than $18 million. But guess what? They added an insurance plan to cover the 20 million, cover up to 20 million, right? So we start to see this becoming more and more of a thing where people have cyber insurance, if you will. Riviera Beach in Florida, $600,000 they paid it. It shut down the city's website, email server, billing system, so it rendered that city basically shut them down, right? They invested $900,000 into new hardware to rebuild their IT infrastructure. This is even outside of the $600,000 because some aspects of it couldn't be decrypted, if you will. Lake City, $460,000 paid it. New Bedford, Massachusetts, $5.3 million. They did not pay it. They attempted to negotiate to get it down to something more reasonable at $400,000, but the ransomware authors didn't go for that. So it affected 158 workstations, which was 4% of the city's infrastructure. City of New Orleans, 4,000 machines. They raised their cyber insurance from $3 million to $10 million, largely enough. The ransom, what it was and if they paid, wasn't published here. So again, while these are some examples, some people don't like to talk about that the fact that they were hit with ransomware, what the ransomware was, or even if they paid it. All right, so from a private sector, healthcare, education, Wood Ranch Medical Center in California, don't know the ransom amount, 5,800 medical records inaccessible, backup server encrypted. Organization went out of business because of this. Another healthcare system, unknown ransom. Surgeries were canceled. ER patients were transferred. Right? This becomes the going thing. Rockville School District. Initial ransom of $176,000. They negotiated it down to $88,000. Still don't know if they paid it or not. Insurance costs covered $10,000 of it based upon based upon a $10,000 deductible. So cool, this ransomware theme seems like something that's sophisticated or hard to do. Well, there's ransomware for the less skilled. And in that construct, there's open source. So this is code that's being developed, put out there for the community to use. And we see a number of open source variants available. There's also ransomware as a service where you could pay somebody to host your ransomware and do the ransom launching on your behalf. All right. So Stampedo for $39 gives you a lifetime license. All right. So it could be inexpensive, but it could have a large footprint in which it renders for whoever that malware person is. The next one is something to the tune of $380 for an unlimited license. They have a marketing video actually on YouTube that you can check out. It's customizable in the sense that you can build your ransomware to meet the campaign that you're trying to do. Interesting. Right? So from this perspective, Satan actually allows us to build our ransomware as well. So we can pick the ransom amount, we can pick the Bitcoin address, we can pick how we want to multiply it. And for a fee of 30% of the profits, this is something that could be utilized. So if we were going to do this, maintain 70% of the profit, 30% of it goes back to the people who run this platform. So it could be lucrative in that perspective as well. The initial phases, well, it goes without saying, just like some of the other ones. There's an installation phase. We're going to contact some command and control server. The command and control server is going to be authenticated with the actual machine that's contacting it. We're going to utilize encryption to encrypt files on the system, and then we're going to extort them by way of encrypting their files and leaving a message saying this is how they can get their information back. So you may be thinking, because largely that's what we've been talking about, well, if you don't use Windows, then you're clear from ransomware. Well, that's not the case. So there's ransomware for Linux machines, Mac, iOS if you're into iPhones, Android, right? There's a ransomware variant for many types of systems and machines out there. All right, so from a Linux perspective, an example is one that targets web servers, because largely speaking, Linux is used for web servers, and it wanted 1 Bitcoin per file. What's the cost of a Bitcoin? Depends at the time of the infection. From a Mac perspective, we had Patcher looking at $300. iOS, it really wasn't locking. I'm sorry, it really wasn't encrypting the files. What it would do was gain access to a person's iCloud, change their iCloud password, and then it would lock the phone. Lock the phone so the user could not access it. And it wanted a ransom of $100. All right, so cool. With all that ransomware that we talked about, probably seemed like it was fun. There were some people that are probably terrified. But what else can we do? Well, let's talk about ransomware of the future. Everything has an IP address these days, from your, your trash can to your cameras to your Alexa, maybe your car, your stove. Everything is starting to have IP addresses. So what's next? Well, think of ransomware hitting pacemakers. Now we're truly talking about life or death. Think about ransomware hitting automobiles, because there's Wi-Fi and all this other type stuff in there. Think about what that looks like. Imagine getting off from work, trying to get in your vehicle, can't start it because you've been hit with ransomware. That's a scary thing to consider. Or even your house. So really, when I talk about the future of ransomware, it's really now. So DEF CON is a cybersecurity conference held in Las Vegas. And in there was a proof of concept, if you will, back in 2016, where some hackers actually hacked a thermostat. And we can see the ransom message that was put on that thermostat. So they were essentially locking people out until the ransom was paid. And they had the ability to change the temperature and such and so forth. So that's interesting because the future is now. Also, we had an instance where a LG TV was hit with ransomware. Now, this LG TV largely used the Android software as part of its package, if you will. And this ransomware pretended to come from the FBI, wanted to charge people $500. Now, what's interesting is because we could just reset the TV's operating system, which is Android, back to factory default and largely be good. So users didn't have the ability to do that on their own. They contacted LG. LG wanted to charge users $340 just to help. LG, in the end, ended up just providing the reset steps because people were like, well, fine, I'm just not going to use this TV anymore. And LG didn't want that type of heat. So $500 if you paid the ransomware, $340 initially if LG was going to help, and the end, LG provided the reset steps. So if that's where we're at now, where are we going to be in the not so distant future, like 5 years from now? Well, we assessed that business and manufacturing would account for 40% of the Internet of Things, transportation 4.1. All right, so we see that all of these things are just going to increase. And when they increase with connectivity, they also increase with the chances of being hit with ransomware. All right, and that's interesting because, again, the more and more we add, the more and more congested, the more and more or higher likelihood of us being hit with this ransomware. So when hit with ransomware, largely people go through 5 stages, right? They go through denial. We got hit with ransomware? You're joking, right? They just don't believe it happened. Then they get into anger. You're telling me this wormed its way into every system, including the backups? They're mad that it happened. Then they get into bargaining, depending on the position, right? Because if I'm the chief technology officer and my job is to do that and really safeguard my organization's data, I might be asking, can the FBI help us? Can we negotiate the ransom? We want to get this data back with the least amount of impact to the organization. And then you get into this depression phase, right? Oh man, this could probably end my career. Our share is down 30%. You're depressed because at this point, there's nothing you can do. you're beholden to the ransomware authors. And then you might get into the acceptance stage where, okay, let's just try to pay them. All right. So again, 5 stages of grief there. Well, how do we avoid that? Well, here's a little bit. I'm going to give you the playbook. Take regular backups. If it's important to you, make a backup of it. Store them offline, either on a tape or off-site somewhere. So that way, if your organization gets compromised, you can always refer back to those backups. If you make them accessible on the very network that you're trying to defend, then you're taking a huge chance. Don't click on links or download attachments in unknown, unexpected emails. This goes without saying, and people still do it. Also, don't be so quick to click on links from emails that look like they came from people that you actually know. Maybe reach out to the person and say, hey, John Bob, I got this email from you with a link. I just want to verify that it was you that actually sent it. All right. We want to use security software that gives us multi-layer protection in defense of our organization. This allows us to really highlight some of this maliciousness and or the ransomware as it starts to encrypt. If we have the visibility or the ability to highlight where system files are starting to be encrypted and our security software prompts us because, hey, this isn't normal of a system use, well, we could largely start to save ourselves. We want to use unique, strong passwords so that way they're not easily guessable or people can't use them to laterally move throughout our organization. And we also want to keep our software up to date. That also kind of goes without saying. Some other mitigations and detections. Well, there's a website, KnowBefore. It allows us to download a ransomware simulator running on our system utilizing 16 different scenarios, and it will highlight to us what the ransomware could have actually got to, right? In the sense of, hey, ransomware 1, it actually would have encrypted all your files without even any form of detection. Okay, ransomware variant 2 wouldn't have worked because this setting on your system or this type of software. So the screenshot there kind of shows that output that we would have by utilizing KnowBefore. There's no more ransom. It also assists with ransom identification. This is a conglomerate of a number of organizations and individual researchers that have come together to highlight the ability to depict what type of ransomware you've been hit with if it's unknown, and if there is a known decryptor, the website also contains that for you as well, and it's free. There's ID ransomware that's going to help with ransomware identification, and there's roughly 800 or so variants on there as well. So we largely probably have seen this chart before, but we know when we start at hash values of an actual binary or a program, well, that's trivial for us to really stop a person with. If a person of malicious intent is utilizing IP addresses, well, we can easily or they can easily get around that, right? And as we go up the pyramid, the hardest thing for somebody of malicious intent to get around is their TTPs, the way that they do things. So that's where we want to look to affect people and inform and really input defenses. So with all that being said, here's some reasons why you should pay. Well, to get your files back, and I say maybe because we already talked about some people who even pay don't even have the decryptors don't even work. FBI has previously stated the easiest path to get your stuff back is just to pay, and it might be cheaper in the long run. Now, with all that being said, there are some reasons why you should not pay. Because the US CERT and the FBI clearly say no, you should not pay, even though they say that's probably the quickest way to get your stuff back. It may seem cheaper, but it's really not, right? Disclosures are not cheap. There's a target on your back because if you pay once, then maybe you'll pay again. And there's really no guarantee that you would even get your data back. So if you've been hit with ransomware, what can you do? Well, contact your friendly neighborhood hacker or defender or somebody doing cybersecurity. Research the variant on your own to see if one of those sites that we talked about would even help you. Definitely take the machine offline or ensure that it doesn't have the ability to proliferate across your network. Change all passwords and, if possible, wait. Wait as long as you can, wait as long as you have to before even having to make a decision. All right, so with that, here are some references that I used to put together this presentation. And with that, I am at the end. So again, my name is Fernando Tomlinson. This presentation could be found on my website. If you're interested in any of my code, or if you just want to keep in contact and follow me, there's my handle on Twitter. All right, thanks.